The Turvacs were a race of proud and ancient beings, once considered among the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. Their homeworld, Jarin, was a jewel in the star system, a beautiful planet with vast oceans, sprawling cities, and a culture rich with history. But now, that world was dying. The Turvacs were faced with an enemy they could not defeat, a plague that spread faster than they could find a cure. The disease didn't just destroy the body, it attacked the mind. People were left weak and delirious, unable to think or care for themselves. The once vibrant cities were now silent, the streets abandoned. Those who weren't infected had nowhere to go. The rich, the powerful, and the ruling class had all fled to other worlds. The weak, the old, the sick, they were left behind to die alone. For months, the Turvacs sent out distress signals, hoping for help from the galactic community. But their calls were met with silence. The Galactic Council, a collection of the most powerful races in the galaxy, declared that the Turvacs were beyond saving. The plague was too dangerous to risk spreading to other worlds. There would be no assistance. On the far side of the galaxy, Captain Elias Carter of the human starship Vanguard was looking over the latest galactic news reports when he came across the story of the Turvacs. The images were heartbreaking. A once proud race brought to its knees by an uncontrollable disease. The galactic powers were content to let them suffer and die. But Elias couldn't look away. He felt a pang in his heart. Why isn't anyone helping them? Elias muttered to himself. His crew gathered around him in the ship's briefing room, their faces grim. The whole galaxy's turned their back on them. No one's even trying to help. Why should we? His second-in-command, Lieutenant Rivera, asked. We have our own issues to deal with. The plague might spread to us. Elias looked around the room. He saw fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else, a spark of something deeper, something human. They were terrified, but they were also decent people. It doesn't matter, Elias said firmly. If no one else is going to help them, then we will. There were murmurs among the crew. Some were unsure, others worried about the dangers of the plague. But Elias knew what he had to do. This wasn't just a mission. This was about doing what was right. Prepare for an emergency jump, he ordered. We're going to Jarin. The crew began their preparations, the mood shifting from hesitation to determination. They weren't just going to follow orders. They were going to make a difference. They were going to help. When the Vanguard entered Turvac space, the sight that greeted them was one of devastation. The once glorious planet was now a shadow of itself. The cities were empty, their towering structures now covered in creeping vines and dust. Smoke rose from the remnants of buildings, and the air was thick with a sense of loss. We need to be careful, Elias warned his crew. We don't know what we're walking into. The ship descended toward the surface, the atmosphere thick with tension. When they landed, the crew saw what they feared most: empty streets and lifeless buildings. The Turvacs, who had once been so proud and regal, now walked in a daze, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. They barely acknowledged the presence of the humans who had come to help them. The team moved quickly, setting up a temporary medical base and scanning the area for any sign of resistance or danger. But there was nothing, just the quiet, sorrowful sounds of a civilization on the brink of collapse. As Elias looked out over the city, he couldn't help but feel a deep sadness. He had known from the beginning that this mission was dangerous, but the sight before him was more devastating than he could have imagined. The Turvacs, once the rulers of this world, had been reduced to survivors with no hope, abandoned by all. We can't let them die like this, Elias said softly to Lieutenant Rivera, who stood by his side. They've been abandoned by everyone else, Rivera replied quietly. Why should we care? We don't even know them. Elias looked at the lieutenant, his voice filled with conviction. Because we're human. And when everyone else turns their back, we step forward. We don't leave anyone behind. Rivera nodded, understanding the weight of his words. They weren't just a crew. They were humanity's last chance for hope. As the sun set over Jarin, the crew of the Vanguard worked tirelessly, knowing that the fate of the Turvax rested on their shoulders. They were their last hope, the final line between life and death. In the silence of the night, as the first stars began to appear in the sky, Elias Carter stared out into the darkness. His mind was focused, his heart steady. He had made the decision to come here, to help a race no one else cared about. But in his heart, he knew something else, that this mission would define humanity for generations to come. The Turvax would not be abandoned, not on his watch. And if humanity was to rise in the galaxy, it would begin right here, with these forgotten people. As the Vanguard settled onto the surface of Jarin, Captain Elias Carter stood at the ship's bridge, staring out the window at the dying planet below. The vast cityscape stretched before him, now abandoned and crumbling, covered in layers of dust and ash. The once beautiful world was now a ghost of its former self. He could feel the weight of the decision he had made settling deeper into his chest. This wasn't just another mission. It was a statement. Elias knew that by disobeying the orders of the Galactic Council, they were risking not only their lives, but the future of Earth's reputation in the galaxy. The Council had forbidden any interference with the Turvax's struggle, insisting that the plague was too dangerous and too contagious to risk spreading to other worlds. But Elias believed there was something more important than orders, doing what was right. He turned to his crew and spoke firmly. "We're here because no one else would come. The Turvax have been abandoned. We're their last hope. We're going to give them that." His crew, though uncertain, nodded in agreement. They all understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a matter of saving a species. It was about proving that humanity stood for something greater than fear. As they unloaded supplies from the ship and began setting up medical stations, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the people of Jarin had already given up. They were survivors, yes, but without hope. Lieutenant Rivera, his second-in-command, walked up to him as he surveyed the surrounding area. The wind whipped dust through the air, making the city's ruined buildings look even more desolate. "Do you really think this is going to work?" Rivera asked quietly, her voice filled with doubt. She looked out over the lifeless landscape, her brow furrowed. Elias sighed. "I don't know, Rivera, but we have to try. If we don't, they die. And not just the Turvax. We all lose something." His voice grew softer, but there was no mistaking the determination in it. "We can't leave anyone behind." Rivera hesitated before nodding. She knew Elias was right. No matter how dangerous this mission was, they couldn't walk away. Not when there was a chance to save so many lives. The crew began working swiftly to set up medical tents and distribute the first round of treatment supplies. As the humans went to work, the Turvax watched from a distance, unsure and wary. They were not used to receiving help, especially from outsiders. The plague had left them weak and distrustful. They had been abandoned by their allies and left to rot by the galactic powers who had once considered them equals. Some of the Turvax looked at the humans with a mixture of suspicion and hope. Others simply turned away, too tired and sick to care. But Elias noticed a few young Turvax who approached the human team cautiously. One of them, a young male with striking green skin and piercing eyes, stepped forward and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Why risk your lives for us?" Elias met the young Turvax's gaze, trying to find the right words. "Because we believe that no one should be left to die alone. Your people matter. We won't turn our backs on you." The Turvax stared at him, their eyes filled with disbelief. For so long they had been told they were beyond saving, and now here were humans who were willing to risk everything to help them. It didn't make sense, but something about Elias's sincerity made them listen. One of the human doctors, Dr. Ava Holden, knelt beside a group of sick Turvax and began administering the first dose of medicine. The treatment wasn't a cure yet, but it was the first step toward something better. The plague had been spreading for so long that there were few left who could remember what it was like to feel well again. Yet, as the medicine entered their bodies, something small but powerful happened. A Turvax who had been sitting quietly in a corner suddenly stood up, blinking in surprise. He looked at his hands, then at the humans who were helping him. It wasn't much, but the plague's grip seemed to weaken, if only for a moment. Elias watched this from a distance, his heart beating faster. "It's working," Dr. Holden whispered, barely able to believe it. "We're not done yet," Elias said, his voice steady but full of hope. "We have a long road ahead of us, but this is the start we need." Hours passed, and the humans continued their work, treating the sick, offering food and water, and doing everything they could to help the Turvax regain some semblance of strength. Slowly, the Turvax began to show signs of life. The once lifeless eyes of the sick began to sparkle with hope. It was only a small change, but it was a change nonetheless. As night fell, Elias stood at the edge of the medical camp, looking up at the stars. The sky above was vast and empty, the same sky that had once looked down on a thriving civilization. Now, the stars seemed to offer little comfort, but the humans weren't giving up, and neither were the Turvax. In the distance, Elias could hear the sounds of movement as the sick slowly got to their feet, some of them cautiously walking toward the humans for the first time. It wasn't just medicine that was healing them. It was something more. It was the knowledge that they weren't alone anymore. The humans had arrived, and they had brought hope with them. As Elias gazed out into the night, he knew the road ahead would be difficult. The plague hadn't been beaten yet, and there were still many obstacles to overcome. But one thing was certain. The Turvax now had something they hadn't had in a long time: hope. And that hope, he believed, could change everything. The sun rose slowly over Jarin, casting its pale light over the city. The medical camp set up by the humans was buzzing with activity, though the atmosphere still felt heavy. The Turvax were showing signs of improvement, but the battle against the plague was far from over. Captain Elias Carter stood outside, watching as his crew continued to work. The task ahead seemed endless, but he knew they couldn't give up. Not now. Inside the medical tents, the humans were working around the clock, treating the sick, offering hope, and trying to stabilize the planet's most vulnerable citizens. Dr. Ava Holden and her team were managing the bulk of the medical work, administering new treatments, and carefully monitoring the Turvax's progress. But every time they thought they had made a breakthrough, a new challenge seemed to appear. "Captain," Dr. Holden called, stepping outside the tent to speak with Elias. Her face was tired, but there was determination in her eyes. "The treatments are working, but we need more time. The plague has mutated in some of the Turvax. Some of them are becoming resistant to the medicine." Elias frowned. "How long do we have?" Dr. Holden glanced over her shoulder at the Turvax who were resting in the makeshift hospital. "If we can't develop a more effective cure, they won't survive much longer. And the worst part is, we don't have much of that time." The weight of her words hit Elias hard. He had come to Jarin to offer hope, but now it seemed like the planet might slip through their fingers, just like the others had. The thought of losing the Turvax after everything they had been through was unbearable. "We can't give up," Elias said firmly. "We'll find another way. We're not leaving without helping them." Dr. Holden nodded, but she didn't look entirely convinced. "We'll need more resources, and we'll need access to their main laboratories. Without their research, we can't possibly come up with anything faster." Elias knew what that meant. The Turvax had once been the most advanced race in the galaxy, their scientific knowledge unrivaled. But now, the laboratories that held the key to the cure were abandoned and left in ruins. The only chance of finding a solution lay in the ancient archives of Jarin, deep within their ruined city. "I'll take a team to the central labs," Elias decided. "We can't afford to wait. You stay here with the others, and keep working on the current treatments. We'll get you the research you need." A small team of humans, including Lieutenant Rivera, and a few of the best engineers and medics volunteered to join Elias on the dangerous journey. The central labs were located in the heart of the city, but it was a place no one had entered in years. Buildings had crumbled, and the streets were littered with debris. Yet Elias was determined. They would go, no matter what. The team set out early in the morning, making their way through the city's deserted streets. The silence around them was eerie. The once bustling marketplace was now a forgotten place, its stalls left empty, its goods rotting. As they walked, Elias couldn't help but notice the hollow looks in the eyes of the Turvacs who passed them. Many were too weak to speak or even move, their bodies broken by the plague. "It's hard to believe this was once a thriving world," Rivera remarked, looking at the ruined buildings. Elias nodded. "It's hard to imagine, but this was a place of great power. They had the knowledge to change the galaxy. If we can't save them, no one will." As they ventured further into the city, the signs of the plague became even more visible. Whole buildings had been abandoned in a hurry, their entrances barricaded. The streets, once lined with proud statues and beautiful fountains, were now overgrown with weeds and vines. It was as though nature itself had reclaimed the city, erasing any trace of the glory it had once held. They reached the central lab's outer gates just as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. The building, though partially destroyed, still held some of its majesty. Elias approached the entrance, taking a deep breath. He had no idea what they would find inside. The Turvacs had been a proud people, and it was possible that the lab had been left in disarray after the plague's outbreak. Yet Elias had to believe that there was something useful, something that could save the Turvacs. "Let's move quickly," Elias instructed. "We don't have much time." As they entered the building, they were met with a chilling sight. The lab was dark, its lights long gone, but the air inside was heavy with the scent of decay. The computers and equipment were damaged, most of them useless. Still, Elias and his team moved forward, carefully searching for any trace of usable data. "We'll have to manually search through their archives," said Rivera. "It could take hours, maybe days." "Do what you can," Elias said. "We don't have that much time." The team worked in silence, their flashlights sweeping over rows of abandoned workstations. They found notes, scattered papers, and broken equipment, but nothing that seemed useful. Elias was beginning to feel the weight of failure pressing down on him when suddenly, one of the engineers, a young man named Jacob, shouted, "I found something. It's a data core. It's still intact." Elias rushed over to Jacob, his heart racing. The data core was small and dusty, but it seemed to be in working condition. Elias took it from Jacob and carefully examined it. If this contained the right information, it could mean the difference between life and death for the Turvacs. "Let's get this back to the ship," Elias said. "This might be our ticket to finding the cure." As the team made their way back to the Vanguard, Elias felt a renewed sense of hope. The battle was far from over, but they had something now. They had a chance. The fate of the Turvacs hung in the balance, but Elias wasn't going to give up, not when there was still hope to be found. The Vanguard hovered above Joran's surface, its engines humming steadily. Inside the ship's command center, Elias Carter sat at the controls, watching as the engineers worked to unlock the data core they had found. It had been a long day, and even though the team had brought back a small glimmer of hope, Elias knew the situation was dire. Time was running out for the Turvacs, and they had to act fast. "Any progress?" Elias asked, glancing over at Jacob, the young engineer who had handled the data core. Jacob wiped his forehead, his eyes tired but focused. "We've accessed the data, Captain. It's a bit fragmented, but there's enough here to work with. We've got genetic sequences, research on the plague, but we're going to need to run some tests." Elias nodded. "Do whatever you need to do. Every minute counts." Dr. Ava Holden, who had joined Elias in the command center, looked over the data screen with a frown. "This research is promising, Elias. It's not just the plague's cure. This might be something bigger. They were working on a new treatment for their entire species. If we can apply this, we might save them. The idea of saving an entire species was thrilling, but Elias had learned never to get too hopeful too quickly. There were still many unknowns. He crossed his arms and leaned against the console. How long do we have? Ava sighed. Based on the latest reports from the surface, we've got maybe 3 days before the remaining Turvacs succumb to the disease. I'm not sure we can develop anything new in that short amount of time. Elias' mind raced as he considered the possibilities. He couldn't afford to fail them. Jarin had been left behind by the rest of the galaxy. The Turvacs had been abandoned, and now it was up to humanity to either save them or watch as their entire civilization vanished forever. Let's focus on what we can do, Elias said. Jacob, can you isolate the sequences? See if there's a treatment plan we can work with right now. Jacob nodded, working quickly. I'm on it, Captain. This might take a few hours, though. Elias turned to Ava. What's the plan here, Doc? Can we work with what we have, or do we need to dive deeper into the research? Ava took a deep breath. We're not sure yet. The disease is complicated, and while these sequences seem like they could be a breakthrough, we need more data to be certain. If the treatment isn't fully developed, it might not work. Worse, it could make things worse. The weight of her words hung in the air. Elias couldn't help but feel the pressure mounting on his shoulders. They had brought hope to the Turvacs, but now they had to deliver results. He couldn't let them down. Can you replicate their methods? Elias asked. Ava glanced at the data again, running her fingers through her hair. It's possible, but I'll need time to understand their approach. If we had access to their full lab facilities, it would be faster. I'm not asking for miracles, Doc, Elias replied. Just do what you can with what we've got. We'll have to move fast. The clock ticked away relentlessly, and the tension in the ship grew. Jacob continued to analyze the data, while Ava studied the genetic sequences, running them through simulations. Elias stood nearby, his thoughts wandering back to the Turvacs. The way they had looked at the humans with a mix of gratitude and desperation haunted him. They had been abandoned by everyone, left to fight their own battle. And now, it was up to them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jacob called out from the workstation. Captain, I've isolated the sequence. I think we've got a treatment, but I'll need your approval to begin synthesizing it. Elias didn't hesitate. Do it. If there's any chance this works, we have to try. Ava joined them, her voice calm but urgent. This treatment won't be easy. If we administer it, we might see results in a day or two, but we could also see severe reactions. We're taking the huge risk. Elias stared at the data on the screen. The fate of an entire species rested on their next move. He wasn't going to back down. We'll risk it. They need us. Humanity is their last hope. The decision was made. Jacob immediately began working on synthesizing the treatment. While the engineer worked with remarkable speed, Ava continued analyzing the data, ensuring that they weren't missing anything crucial. After hours of hard work, the first batch of the synthesized treatment was ready. Elias, along with a small team, suited up and made their way back down to the surface of Jarin. The air was still thick with the weight of uncertainty, but this time, they had something to offer. The Turvacs looked up as the human team arrived, their faces a mix of exhaustion and hope. Elias approached the central medical tent, where the sick were being treated, and handed over the first batch of the treatment. "This is for all of you," he said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "It's not perfect, but it's the best we can do. We're not giving up on you." The Turvacs leader, a proud figure named Decora, stepped forward. His body was frail from the disease, but his eyes still burned with fire. "You came when no one else would. We owe you everything." Elias nodded. "Now it's up to you. Take the treatment, and we'll see what happens." One by one, the Turvacs took the treatment. They were weak, but they had come this far. As Elias watched, he held his breath, knowing that the next few days would determine everything. Would the treatment work, or was it too late? As the team waited, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this was humanity's moment. They had arrived when all others had turned their backs. And now, humanity would do everything it could to save these people. The race against time was on, and the world watched in silence. The days on Jaren felt like years. Elias paced back and forth in the command center aboard the Vanguard, his eyes flicking to the holographic displays that tracked the Turvax's condition. The treatment they had administered was still in its early stages, but the first signs were already beginning to show. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the glimmer of hope alive. Dr. Ava Holden stood by the console, her eyes fixed on the data. There's an improvement in their vitals, Elias. Not much, but enough to show that the treatment is working. We're not out of the woods yet, but this is progress. Elias exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. Progress is all we need. We can't afford to fail them. Ava glanced at him, her face tired but determined. I know, but we have to be careful. There's a lot we don't understand about this disease, and even though the Turvax are showing signs of improvement, it's still too early to know if they'll fully recover. Elias nodded. It had only been a few days since the treatment was first given, but he couldn't help but feel a deep connection to the Turvax now. They had trusted humanity when no one else had. Their whole world had been on the brink of collapse, and yet here they were, still fighting, still hoping. Meanwhile, Jacob had been working around the clock to analyze the data coming in from the surface. The young engineer was exhausted, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, but he refused to take a break. He understood what was at stake just as much as anyone. Captain, Dr. Holden. Jacob called from the workstation, his voice tinged with excitement. I've been looking through the data, and there's something strange. The plague's symptoms are starting to reverse faster than expected. We're getting higher levels of cellular regeneration than we thought possible. Ava hurried over to Jacob's console, her eyes scanning the new data. You're right, this is definitely more than just a temporary improvement. It's almost like the Turvax are regenerating at an accelerated rate. Elias couldn't hide his relief. Does this mean the treatment is working? Jacob nodded. It's working, but we need more time to see the full effects. We're getting positive results, but we have to be cautious. This kind of regeneration is rare, and we don't know what side effects might appear. Ava's gaze remained on the screen. There's no turning back now. If we stop the treatment now, the Turvax could regress. We have to see this through. Elias agreed. Keep monitoring the situation. If anything changes, let me know. As the hours passed, the Vanguard's crew remained focused. They watched as the Turvax gradually began to show signs of life they hadn't seen in days. Some of the sick were sitting up, their feverish faces becoming more stable. The tremors that had racked their bodies seemed to lessen. While it was still too early to declare victory, Elias couldn't deny that the change was real. On the surface, the Turvax gathered together, their eyes filled with curiosity and caution as they noticed the change in their people. Cora, their leader, had been one of the first to receive the treatment. He had been weak and frail when they arrived, barely able to stand. Now he walked with a little more strength in his steps, his eyes brighter than they had been for days. He met Elias and Ava outside the central medical tent, his voice raspy but full of gratitude. We never thought we would see this day. You have given us hope. Elias placed a hand on his shoulder, careful not to overstep. You've done most of the work, Cora. You've held on. Now we're just helping you get back on your feet. Cora nodded slowly, his expression solemn but hopeful. Without you, we would have perished. But now, it seems, perhaps we have a chance. Ava smiled softly. It's not over yet. We still need to monitor your progress and adjust the treatment as needed. Cora's face softened. We trust you. If we can be saved, it will be because of you and your people. Back aboard the Vanguard, Elias sat in the command center, watching the reports come in from the surface. The Turvax were getting stronger every hour, and the rate of recovery seemed to be accelerating. He could hardly believe it. There was a chance, no, a real chance, that the Turvax could survive this plague, and it was thanks to humanity's intervention. But there was still a nagging feeling in the back of Elias' mind. What if the disease had adapted in some way? What if the treatment would eventually stop working? They had only just begun to understand the plague's true nature, and there was no guarantee that it wouldn't come back with a vengeance. "We've come so far, Elias," Ava said, breaking his train of thought. "But we still have a long road ahead. The Turvax are resilient, but we can't let our guard down." "I know," Elias replied, his voice quiet. "We'll keep pushing. We can't stop now." The fate of an entire species hung in the balance. Humanity had answered the call when everyone else had abandoned the Turvax. They had brought hope to a dying world, but the journey wasn't over. There were still tests to be run, still dangers to face. But in the quiet of the Vanguard's command center, with the stars stretching out before them, Elias allowed himself a moment to hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, he believed that the Turvax might just have a future, and that humanity had given them that future. Weeks had passed since the treatment began, and the Turvax continued to show signs of improvement. Their recovery was slow, but it was undeniable. The plague that had nearly wiped them out seemed to be losing its grip on them, and hope was rising. Yet, as Elias stood in the observation deck of the Vanguard, gazing at the stars, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. On the surface of Jarin, the Turvax were beginning to rebuild their cities. The sounds of construction echoed through the valleys as the once quiet world came to life again. The Turvax worked side by side with the humans, rebuilding the infrastructure that had been lost in the wake of the plague. There was an energy in the air, a sense of unity that had been missing for so long. Takora, the Turvax leader, was at the forefront of this effort. He had once been frail, barely able to speak above a whisper, but now he walked with strength and purpose. His people were looking to him for guidance, and he was determined to lead them into a new future. "How are they doing, Captain?" Ava's voice broke through Elias's thoughts as she stepped into the observation room. Elias turned to her, a tired but content smile on his face. "Better than I expected. The recovery rate is still slower than we'd like, but they're improving." Ava nodded, her expression thoughtful. "The treatments have worked wonders. But now it's time to think about the next step. We need to help them rebuild their society." Elias glanced at the planet below, the shimmering surface of Jarin bathed in the light of its twin suns. "That's the hardest part. We've given them a chance to survive. Now we need to make sure they thrive." Ava agreed. The Turvax need more than just medicine. They need a path forward. We can't just give them hope. We need to show them how to use it. Elias's mind wandered to the conversations he had had with Takora. The Turvax had once been a proud, powerful race, but the plague had stripped them of their strength. They were survivors, but they had forgotten how to rebuild. Humanity had been their lifeline, but it was clear that the Turvax would need to stand on their own 2 feet soon. "We'll need to guide them," Elias said. "Help them rediscover their strengths. They've lost so much, and they need more than just our help. They need to believe in themselves again." Ava looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "And we'll be there every step of the way. We can't just give them the tools. We need to teach them how to use them. They need to know they're not alone, that we're a team." Elias felt a surge of pride. He had always believed in humanity's ability to make a difference, but seeing the Turvax begin to rebuild their society was something else entirely. It wasn't just about saving them. It was about giving them the chance to shape their own future, to take control of their destiny once more. On the ground, Takora had already started working on the plans for Jarin's reconstruction. The cities were being rebuilt with the help of human engineers, but the Turvax were learning quickly. They had always been a technologically advanced species, and now, with the plague behind them, they were beginning to rediscover their former glory. As Takora stood in the ruins of the largest city, He gazed out over the broken buildings, his heart heavy with the weight of his people's loss. But as he looked up at the stars, he saw the faintest glimmer of light. It was the light of a new beginning, a promise that his people could rise again. "We owe them everything," Decorah said softly, his voice almost lost in the wind. Ava, standing beside him, smiled gently. "You owe yourselves everything, Decorah. You've fought for your survival. You've shown the galaxy what it means to never give up." Decorah turned to her, his eyes reflecting the stars above. "I'm not sure we could have made it without your help. The Turvax are not just survivors. We are a people with a history, and now we have a future." The Turvax were beginning to believe in that future once more. They had once been a species defined by their strength, but now they were learning the value of community, of collaboration. The plague had nearly destroyed them, but it had also given them the chance to rediscover what mattered most, each other. As the Vanguard stayed in orbit above Jarin, Elias felt a deep sense of fulfillment. They had come to this world to save lives, but now they were part of something much greater. Humanity's influence had given the Turvax the chance to survive, but it was their resilience, their determination, that would shape the future. Elias turned to Ava, a quiet smile on his face. "They'll make it. I can feel it." Ava nodded. "Yes, they will. And we'll be here to make sure they don't have to do it alone." Together, humanity and the Turvax were building a future, one where hope was not just a fleeting feeling, but a tangible, lasting truth. The road ahead was long, but they were no longer walking it alone. As the stars stretched out before them, Elias couldn't help but think that this was only the beginning. The Vanguard was preparing to leave orbit, its crew ready to move on to the next mission. Yet for Elias and Ava, the journey they had begun with the Turvax felt far from over. The planet Jarin had transformed in a short amount of time, but the real test was yet to come. The Turvax had survived, they had learned, and now they had to decide what they would become. Would they return to their old ways, or would they forge a new future, one built on unity, resilience, and hope? Elias stood at the helm of the Vanguard, watching as the planet grew smaller in the viewport. His heart was heavy but full of hope. Jarin had become a symbol of what could be achieved when different species worked together. The Turvax had learned from humanity, but they had also taught humanity something invaluable in return: the power of resilience. "I can't believe it's finally time to leave," Ava said, standing beside him. Her voice was quiet, yet there was a sense of satisfaction in her words. Elias nodded, his gaze still fixed on the planet. "We've done everything we could. Now, it's their turn." The Turvax were no longer the fragile, broken people they had once been. They were rebuilding their cities, their culture, and their sense of self. Decorah had become a leader of not just his people, but of a new way of thinking. He had embraced the idea that survival was not enough, that true strength came from rebuilding, learning, and forging new connections. The Turvax no longer saw themselves as victims of a plague, but as survivors who had overcome impossible odds. Ava watched him carefully. "What's next for us?" Elias turned to face her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I don't know. The galaxy is still full of unknowns, but I think we've proven something important." "What's that?" "That humanity has the power to change things. We're not just a species fighting for survival anymore. We're a species that can help others, guide them, give them hope." Ava smiled, the weight of their accomplishments settling in her chest. "We've done more than that, Elias. We've helped a whole species find their future." In the days that followed, the Turvax continued to grow stronger. Their cities, once reduced to rubble, were now filled with life and activity. The streets were busy with people rebuilding, learning, and growing. Children who had never known a world without fear now played in the streets, their laughter echoing through the cities. The sense of hope that had been instilled in them was becoming a foundation, a building block for a new future. Decorah had become a powerful voice for his people, but he had not done it alone. His people had supported him every step of the way. And in turn, he had led them with wisdom and compassion. He was no longer just a leader. He was a symbol of their strength, a beacon guiding them toward the future. One evening, as the sun began to set over Jarin, Decor stood on a balcony overlooking the city he had once thought lost forever. He could hear the sounds of construction, the steady rhythm of a people rebuilding. His people were no longer just surviving. They were thriving. Ava and Elias had visited him several times during the past few weeks, offering advice and sharing their experiences. But Decor knew that it was time for his people to lead themselves. The lessons they had learned, the strength they had gained, would be their guide. "I never thought I'd see this day," Decor said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "When we were at our lowest, I thought we would never return to this. But now, we are not just surviving. We are living, and we are building." He turned to the human representatives standing beside him, his voice steady and sure. "We will never forget what you've done for us. But now, the future of the Turvax is in our hands, and I promise you, we will honor this gift. We will make sure that our children and their children will never know a world like the one we had before." Elias nodded, a smile breaking through his thoughtful expression. "I know you will, Decora. You've already proven your strength. This is just the beginning." Decora placed a hand over his heart. "The gift you gave us wasn't just life. It was the belief that we could make it. We will make sure that your faith in us is never misplaced." As the stars began to shine in the darkening sky, Elias and Ava made their way back to the vanguard, ready to leave Jarin behind. But they knew, in their hearts, that they would never forget the Turvax. They had made a difference in a way that was beyond anything they had imagined. The Turvax would carry on, not just as survivors, but as a people with a future. They had a long road ahead of them, but now they had hope. And as Elias looked back one last time, he knew that humanity had fulfilled its purpose. They had helped a dying species survive, and in doing so, they had become a part of something greater than themselves. The stars stretched out before them, endless and full of possibilities. For humanity and the Turvax, the journey was just beginning. And together, they would reach for the future, hand in hand.